What is up, my people? It's the Motley GM. I'm back with you again with a little bit of maybe a hot take, maybe a little controversy in what I got to say here, but I want to reach out and see what other people think about this topic. And I'm really curious if you're kind of independent minded as I am. Like, what are your thoughts on this? Do you agree with me? Do you think I'm just rambling stuff for the sake of rambling? Let me know in the comments below. Get in touch. Tell me what you think. What am I talking about today? There's a trend of calling all D20 stat systems basically Dungeons and Dragons. No matter what the system is or what the game is, that's what we call it. Oh, it's just D&D. And where I do understand where this comes from, I think it's a combination of nostalgia and just ease of reference, which, I mean, I get. It's totally how, language works and people work and all those things. So I understand that. I also know that it's something that's promoted by channels and creators that I respect and enjoy watching. So I'm on the fringe here, I feel, or at least in the minority, if nothing else. And I totally accept that. I'm also admitting right off the bat, I absolutely love D20 systems. I think it's the best way to go. It's the easiest to pick up. In my opinion, I by no means only play D20 systems, but they're definitely my favorite. I very much enjoy the D20, and it's easy to use a D20 and the basic idea of 6 stats and roll above a DC and play a game anywhere without even having basically rules in front of you. You could totally do that. And I believe that's a strength and beauty of tabletop games, not necessarily a weakness. However, I do want to say, as much as those things are true, and as much as simplification is something I'm totally for and totally support, as a GM specifically, simplifying things down so it's easier for GMs to just run a game and have fun and not worry so much about living up to some kind of overblown standard that is kind of unrealistic for just a regular guy that has a job and wants to have fun playing games, right? I'm thinking a little bit beyond that. So in this case, I think just calling all these games D&D just oversimplifies. And oversimplification can be bad too. When we oversimplify things, we leave out certain nuances and ideas that really do change something, whether it be tabletop games or almost anything else. But we reduce things to just the basics. It kind of loses something. And I believe that's what we do when we call other games D&D that aren't. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this. I'm going to touch base on at least some of them now. But oversimplification is one of them because I believe it just reduces the games down to its very basic core rules and basic math. And if that were the case, then we wouldn't need books and art and stuff like that. We would just download SRDs and be fine with it. Or have an SRD on a sheet of paper and here's your rules, players, here's my rule, I'm the GM, and we're going to play a game. I mean, that's all we would really need, right? That's what would be a game. However, that's not what games are. And I think it's important to note that. Also, in an era where Dungeons and Dragons as a name brand has become such a corporate entity now, such a lifestyle choice more than a small community of people playing a game. And they themselves, in many ways, have distanced themselves from the OSR and smaller tabletop community, or I should say larger tabletop community that existed before the OSR and all this stuff happened. When we're in that kind of world, I feel there is a line to be drawn. And where those of us that don't wish to associate with those things can easily identify ourselves as not associating ourselves with those types of things, honestly. And I feel that that's okay and that's important too. And again, where I realize I might be the minority here, this is part of the reason why I think that. The other thing I think is very important is that the feel of a game, the lore that's brought into a game, the artwork are all very important and imperative parts of what makes the game what it is. Dungeons and Dragons, again, as I've stated in a previous video, I give credit to the game for being the first of its kind in America that caught on and was able to be sold and mass produced. And it started a community, a larger community of tabletop gamers, larger than the war gamers that this kind of spawned from. There's a whole history there of intermingling games that make Dungeons and Dragons what it was to feel free to look into those histories. There's tons of stuff out there for it. It's super interesting, but I'm not getting into all that history right now. Maybe if people want that, I'll do that down the road, but that's not what I'm doing right now. What I'm trying to say is with the original Dungeons and Dragons, there was not just the two original creators that we most give credit to. There was a very large group of people both playing the game and contributing in their own ways to make Dungeons and Dragons what it became, both before the era of Gygax and Arneson and TSR and after. So Dungeons & Dragons gained its own lore, its own feel, its own artwork. All these things were wonderful things, of course, and things that brought a lot of us into tabletop gaming. But when you look at other game systems, they don't have that same lore. Basic Fantasy right here in front of me is a great example of that, where the artwork is all given by the community. So it's a very different feel when you're looking through the Basic Fantasy books compared to a Dungeons and Dragons book. Is it worse? Is it better? That's up to you to decide. However, it is a different feel. That is for sure. So I really do think if we take those things into account, that we have to understand that a tabletop game is more than just the math equations that make it a mechanical system, right? The system is important, of course, but without the artwork, without the feel, and in many cases, without the lore, or at least the bits of lore that go into a game, if we just deny that those things are true and are real, then we really don't give credit to the people who continue to innovate and create in a field and take on the legacy of those original creators and players that helped to create this community that we love so much. And to say, let's give credit to the other people that keep bringing us up another level, that keep stepping it up and keep refining and bringing in new ideas while maintaining old ideas that stand true and stand the test of time. And I think that's a good thing. We have to look at the people who create the game. We have to look at the writers, the artists. Again, not all D20 games look and feel the same. Here's 3 in front of me, but let's compare. I'm going to take Basic Fantasy away. I'm going to do a video on that one soon. Here's my Dungeon Crawl Classics, another game I love. We'll be talking about that in another separate video. However, here's 3 games right here. These are all D26 stat systems, roll above a DC to win. Right? Each one of these games have an absolutely different feel, have completely different artwork, have different writers who have different ways themselves of GMing and or envisioning like campaigns and adventures and things like that. Dungeon Crawl Classics writes a lot of adventures in-house, but also has a ton of third-party support with adventures and other compatible game systems that makes it very much its own thing, despite being inspired by Dungeons & Dragons originally. Shadow Dark, one of the darlings of the new OSR Uprisings, again, uses the same system, but has a very different feel than Dungeon Crawl Classics does, and a very different feel than Dungeons and Dragons does. Does it do some things the same? Yes. Are there going to be similarities? Of course, but this is a very different feeling game. Even just the way it's written, the way it's put together, it's a very different game, despite having some of the same skeleton. And to contrast all of those, Index Card RPG, a D20 roll over DC game with 6 stats, is a very different feel with very different artwork and evokes a completely different set of ideas, I feel, when you look at the inspiration it gives you through its artwork, as all of these other ones do. Dungeon Crawl Classics, this game evokes a completely different feel and even a completely different idea of the adventures I'm going to run compared to Shadow Dark, compared to Index Card RPG. They might have the same core system, but they both evoke a different feel, and in someone like me, it will evoke a different idea as to how I want to run that game and or the types of stories I wish to tell within that game. And I think that's beautiful. I think that here is 3 examples of games that use a very similar core mechanics system, but do it so differently and so wonderfully differently that you can own all three and never play the same game, even if you're in the same adventure for each one. I think that's a strength to the community, and to kind of disrespect that by just calling all of these D&D, I think is kind of a travesty. And I would really like to not let that be 100%. If I could do anything or say anything about it. I mean, we have to think about the differences here, right? The original creators of D&D came from a different time. They had different ideas of their own. So do all of these writers. I'm pretty sure all the people in these writers represent 2 to 3 generations of people that had different influences in pop culture, different influences in just the times they lived in. And that's, I feel, one of the reasons why they can evoke such different feels, even though they use the same core concept. So I do think that that's something that's important to take into account. The times in which these were created may have been inspired from Dungeons and Dragons, the original one, Advanced, whichever one they claim as their inspiration, but it's also an evolution and becomes its own thing. I think Basic Fantasy RPG is a great example of that as well. Something that started by being inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, but has evolved into its own thing. And although it still maintains the same core mechanics and many similarities, it still is now its own thing, even if similar. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. If we don't give the writers and creators and artists credit for what they contribute to the game to make it what it is, then we're doing them a disservice. In a sense, what I'm trying to say is this: by calling all things D&D and just kind of blanket coding it, it's kind of like saying all people have a skeleton, therefore all people are the same. You see what I mean? It's like, yes, all people have a skeleton and the stuff that makes them a person, but by calling every single person the exact same thing, it's kind of reductive and really takes out a lot of the personality and individuality that makes that person unique, despite that person's similarities to every other human on the face of the planet. And I think this kind of what goes on here. We're taking away from the creativity and the people that continue to evolve and to create games that are even better than the games that we love. Now, if we allow ourselves to let go of nostalgia and look at how these games have evolved, I would absolutely say these are examples of games that do Dungeons and Dragons, or at least what they try to do, and they do it better. And again, that's just my opinion. I like these games better than the old Dungeons and Dragons games. And yes, I will probably catch a lot of hate for that one too. But if I'm going to go all in, I'm going to go all in, guys. That's how we do it here on the channel. And yeah, I prefer any of these games on the table. I will play any of these. Here, I'll just throw this one just so I can flex my Dragon Bane because it looks awesome. I will take any one of these games over Dungeons and Dragons proper any day. Absolutely. Without a doubt. And I think each one of these do the game better, do tabletop better. And fantasy specifically. Again, Index Card covers a few genres, and I love it. I feel Basic Fantasy, Dungeon Crawl Classics, and Shadow Dark are written in a way that you can convert them into other genres very easily. A little bit of creativity and a lot of stealing of ideas could easily turn these into different genres. But especially when we're talking about, toe for toe, if we're just looking at these as fantasy games, if we don't acknowledge everything else that goes into making what that game actually is, and we boil it all down to it's all just Dungeons and Dragons, we're really doing a disservice to the people that innovate and create. Kelsey Dion and Arcane Library with Shadow Dark, Runehammer Games. These are great examples of people that are innovating the game and do it better than I feel Dungeons and Dragons ever did and ever will. And again, I'm going to catch hate for that. I really will. And that's fine. Just keep the hate, clean at least. And I could totally take it. It's fine. You're going to hate on that. But any one of these games I feel does it better. I will have a series on 4 games that I recommend that I feel do Dungeons and Dragons attempt at tabletop games better than they did it. Again, no discredit to Dungeons and Dragons. I'll always have a soft spot in my heart, despite some of the things I say about it, for Dungeons and Dragons. That's going to always remain true. But I have to say, I think these games do it better, and they will continue to do so. So I also think that this is unrealistic in a way to think that a lot of people will adopt this idea that I have. But I'm hoping that a couple people are going to listen and maybe join me in this idea of let's call the game what it is. This is Dragonbane. It's not Dungeons and Dragons. I am playing Dragonbane, or I'm playing Shadow Dark. I'm playing basic fantasy. Call it what it is, because it evokes a different feel. It gives credit to a different group of people who are creative and love creating games just like we do as GMs. Let's give them that credit. I'm hoping to hear from people who want to play modern, old school games in a way and don't necessarily want to associate themselves with a larger corporation. I would love to hear from people who want to play modern games with maybe some of the more modern sensibilities, not going crazy and not getting into politics, just modern sensibilities. I think if we could keep it at that, we could keep it pretty even keeled, right? But at the end of the day, we're going to let Dungeons and Dragons, as its name brand and as its corporation wishes to do, we're going to let them do that. And there's going to be a ton of people, a majority of people that make up tabletop gamers that are going to join that and that are going to continue to play Dungeons and Dragons no matter what. And I'm totally fine with that. They will be the majority and they're going to have their own thing. And I think that's fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But I also think it's okay for us to separate ourselves from that and to do it on purpose. Not because of hate or anything like that. Not because we want to create this dichotomy where there's an other. Not because of that. No, but it's to accept who we are and that we're proud of the fact that we don't follow just some corporate trend. That we're doing what we want to do the way that tabletops were born. To do your thing your way, without being told what to do all the time, and to create your world the way that you want to. And that's something I support on this channel as well. And I'm proud of that, and I hope you are too. So independent games, creators, and the artists that surround these communities, I think are what has become the heart of the tabletop gaming community that I have come to love. And I think that Dungeons and Dragons as a corporate entity, or at least a corporate owned thing now, has left that community behind for the most part. And whether they meant to or not, whether they'll admit it or not, I really don't care. I just feel that's what happened personally. I'm hoping to bring people in and promote these smaller companies that want to tell stories and have fun playing tabletop games, but gives credit to the people that created those games and the artists and the writers and creators that go into it, and extend that to the third-party creators that make these games as big as they are. Index Card RPG and Shadow Dark are great examples of that, so are DCC. All these games are. Basic Fantasy is all third-party creators, basically, besides Chris Gonnerman. I mean, these are the games that make the community what it is, and I love that. Dungeons & Dragons is fine, and if you play that, you go ahead and play that and love it and have fun doing it, and by all means, take some of my tips while you do that. But for me, I'm always going to love these smaller independent games. I'm always going to call them what they are because I love to give credit to those people, and I'm really hoping you might join me in that. And that's a lot to say, I guess, about a small subject. I might get a lot of hate. I might get a lot of love. I have no idea. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say in the comments. What do you think about what I said? What do you think about calling other games Dungeons and Dragons? Do you just not care that much? Do you think it's important to separate these games out and to give credit to the people who created them? Or do you just want to play games and don't give a crap about any of that junk? Let me know in the comments below. I am the Motley GM. I got my own weird way of thinking about tabletop games and the world in general, but I'm glad you stuck this one out with me. I hope to see you next time, and let me remind you people, please play for fun first. Thanks for watching.